Deep within the Montana Territory, archives locked away for more than a century, rests a leather-bound journal unlike any other. At first glance, it appears ordinary, weathered binding faded ink, but its 847 pages conceal one of the most unsettling family histories America has ever buried. The journal surfaced in 1943 when forest rangers clearing an abandoned trapping route stumbled upon a chest half sunk in earth. Inside lay the writings of the Wainwright family, 3 distinct hands, yet all bound by blood and circumstance. What those pages reveal about the winter of 1867 in the remote Bitterroot Mountains unsettled, even hardened investigators. Survival sanity and the very boundaries of human nature were tested within those walls. So disturbing were the contents that authorities classified the documents immediately. For decades, the truth about the Wainwrights was sealed in government vaults, labeled too dark for the public eye. Before we step into that forgotten cabin, before we meet Barnabas Wainwright and his 3 daughters, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. These stories are why we scour America's neglected archives. And in the comments below, let us know which state are you listening from tonight? Because what happened here could have unfolded in any isolated corner of our vast country during those merciless frontier winters. The discovery of this journal reshaped how investigators examined disappearances from the 1860s. For what occurred in that mountain cabin was not simply a family tragedy. It was a systematic record of how grief, hunger, and endless isolation can twist devotion into something unrecognizable. Barnabas Wainwright had not been an ordinary settler. By the age of 42, he was already one of the most successful fur traders operating between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. Known for enduring conditions that defeated lesser men, Barnabas understood the rhythms of the wilderness, when to set traps, where to build shelter, how to bend but not break beneath the weight of winter. His trading post along Beaver Creek became a vital way station for trappers, prospectors, and even the occasional military patrol. To outsiders, the Wainwrights embodied the frontier ideal. Barnabas had married Catherine Bellwether in 1851, the well-educated daughter of a Methodist minister from St. Louis. She had followed him west with quiet determination, mastering the harsh scales of wilderness life, preserving meat, tending wounds, and maintaining a proper household where neighbors were measured in miles, not steps. Together, they raised 3 daughters. Margaret, the eldest, at 26, possessed a near photographic memory and served as the family's record keeper, cataloging weather patterns, trade transactions, and inventories with precision. Elizabeth, 24, became known for her skill with a needle and her gift for healing, treating frostbite infections and broken bones among weary trappers. Sarah, the youngest, at 21, had an uncanny instinct for the natural world, predicting storms before they struck and reading the signs of animal behavior that often meant the difference between safety and disaster. The Wainwright trading post itself stood in a natural clearing, its stout log cabin built on a stone foundation strong enough to endure Montana's brutal winters. A smokehouse, storage shed, and guest cabin surrounded the main lodge, while Beaver Creek wound nearby, offering fresh water year-round. By 1867, the Wainwrights were wealthy by frontier standards. Barnabas controlled lucrative trapping grounds, cultivated trade with native tribes, and held promising mining claims. From Fort Benton to Helena, the Wainwright name carried weight. Even military commanders sought Barnabas's advice on conditions in the north. Meanwhile, Catherine kept close ties with her family in St. Louis through meticulous letters. Her correspondence from the summer of 1867 painted a portrait of comfort and success. She wrote of Margaret's engagement to a prosperous Helena merchant, of Elizabeth's growing reputation as a healer among the region's native communities, and of Sarah's artistic gifts. Her finely drawn sketches of mountain wildlife already attracting the interest of travelers who commissioned her work. The rhythms of frontier life had always been marked by isolation. For the Wainwrights, this meant that much of the year was spent relying solely on one another for conversation, comfort, and companionship. During the long winters, the family's evenings were anchored around the great stone fireplace. Catherine would read aloud from volumes ordered from publishers in the East, her voice filling the cabin with echoes of civilization. The daughters occupied themselves with domestic work, sewing, or repairing, while Barnabas spoke of trade routes, distant encounters, or plans for the next season. For over 15 years, this pattern held steady. Their self-sufficiency, discipline, and devotion to one another had made them admired even among the scattered neighbors who measured distance in miles and days. To the few who knew them, the Wainwrights were proof that refinement and resilience could survive even in the coldest wilderness. But everything changed on October 15, 1867, the day the first blizzard struck. Later generations of old-timers would call it the worst winter in Montana Territory's recorded history. Unlike most storms, this one came without the usual warnings that seasoned frontiersmen could read in the sky. It swept down from the Canadian peaks with a speed and ferocity that left even experienced mountain dwellers stunned. That afternoon, Catherine Wainwright had gone to the creek to wash bedding before the freeze set in. She was returning across the narrow log bridge when the storm's sudden winds knocked her sideways. The structure gave way, plunging her into the icy torrent below. Margaret's journal, written in her careful script, recalls hearing her mother's scream rising above the gale. The three sisters rushed out into the white blindness, following the sound until they found her, pinned beneath the collapsed bridge. Her legs trapped under heavy timbers while freezing water surged around her. It took the combined strength of Barnabas and the three daughters to drag her free. By then, Catherine had been submerged for nearly an hour. Barnabas carried her back to the cabin, her body stiff and pale, her clothing frozen solid against her skin. They stripped away the ice, worked feverishly with every remedy they knew: heated stones, blankets, herbal poultices. But for 3 days, she lingered between delirium and lucidity. Fever shook her body. Her breath came in rattled bursts, and her words drifted back to childhood memories of Missouri names and places her daughters had never heard. On October 18, 1867, Catherine Wainwright died quietly in her sleep. She was 41 years old. For Barnabas, who had not spent a single night apart from his wife in 16 years of marriage, her death was not simply a loss, it was an unraveling. He sat by her body for nearly 12 hours, unmoving, refusing to let the daughters prepare her for burial. Yet, the practical realities of frontier life left little room for mourning. The ground was already frozen hard, making burial impossible until spring. Following the grim custom of the wilderness, Catherine's body was wrapped in quilts and placed in the smokehouse, preserved by the cold until the thaw. Margaret's journal describes the surreal dread of carrying their mother's body to the outbuilding, knowing she would remain there through the entire long winter, only steps away. but it was Barnabas's unraveling mind that most haunted those months. Sarah's entries note the first signs her father abandoning his bed, choosing instead to sit upright in the main room, through the night eyes fixed on the chair where Catherine had once sat. He stopped shaving, stopped washing, let his clothes hang loose and stained. On October 25th, Margaret recorded the first moment of alarm. Barnabas had begun speaking to Catherine's empty chair. At first, his words were practical discussions of trade notes about supplies, reminders about neighbors. But as days passed, his tone softened as though waiting for her reply. The daughters dismissed it as grief. Certain time would restore their father's reason. By early November, however, the behavior grew darker. Barnabas began setting Catherine's place at the table, serving her portions of stew and bread, watching the food cool untouched. When Margaret carefully suggested that this ritual should stop, Barnabas erupted in fury. He accused her of cruelty, of disrespecting her mother's memory, and threatened to forbid her from eating with the family again. What had once been a house of balance and harmony was beginning to tilt, and the long winter had only just begun. The storms closed in, and with them came a silence that felt heavier than snow itself. By late November, the Wainwright family was utterly cut off. The Hendersons' nearest neighbors were 28 miles south, an impossible distance. Once drifts swallowed the trail. The military patrols that sometimes crossed the mountains had suspended their routes until spring. What remained was a family of 4 locked in with their grief, and a father who was beginning to slip beyond their reach. Elizabeth's journal captures the shift with stark clarity. She wrote that their father seemed to be living in a place where mother still walks, but where the rest of us are strangers. She recorded nights when she found Barnabas arguing with Catherine's chair, his voice rising and falling as though answering unseen accusations. To Elizabeth, the worst part was not his words but the pauses, moments when he seemed to listen to responses only he could hear. By Thanksgiving, the snow pressed high against the cabin windows, muting every sound except the constant shriek of wind and the unnerving chorus of wolves outside. Margaret's journals describe the suffocating atmosphere, a home once ordered and alive, now collapsing into disorder. Without Catherine, meals lost rhythm. Some nights passed with Barnabas refusing to eat at all, only to demand extravagant feasts days later in honor of mother. The daughters never knew which version of the father they would face, the broken widower who sobbed openly, or the furious stranger who treated them as intruders. Barnabas began to surround Catherine's chair with her belongings. He carried her clothes, her jewelry, her combs, and trinkets out of their bedroom and arranged them carefully around the hearth. Most disturbing of all, he had clipped Catherine's hair before moving her body to the smokehouse. And now he spent hours each day brushing those severed locks, whispering to them as though Catherine listened. Sarah's diary records one night in particular. She found her father naked by the fireplace, speaking into the dark as though confiding intimate secrets to his wife. His voice carried fragments of memories, their courtship, their wedding night, private moments no child was meant to hear. When Sarah tried to cover him with a blanket, he struck her aside, shouting that she had interrupted a sacred conversation. By December, Barnabas no longer saw his daughters as daughters. His eyes, wild and focused, would rest on them with accusation. He claimed Catherine's spirit was distracted, forced to worry over the girls when she ought to be with him. He accused them of stealing her attention, his voice swerving from pitiful pleading to low animal growls. The girls themselves felt the weight of their prison. Trapped by snow and wolves, they could neither flee nor call for help. Elizabeth's writings describe the daily terror of unpredictability, the fear that at any hour their father might shift from grief to rage, from despair to suspicion. Food too had become a weapon. Supplies carefully calculated for the winter began dwindling, not through consumption but through sabotage. Barnabas threw away cuts of meat, insisting Catherine told him it was spoiled. When the daughters protested, he accused them of poisoning the food to harm him and her. Soon he was hiding provisions in secret caches only he knew. Outside, the wolves gathered. Sarah sketched them in her journal, her artist's eye, capturing the size of the pack. She counted more than 30, far larger than she had ever seen. Night after night, their howls circled the cabin, a chorus that seemed to echo the family's descent. The animals pressed closer each week as though sensing weakness within. Margaret's entry from December 15th marks the turning point. She wrote, "Father spoke to Mother's chair for 3 hours today. When he finally turned to us, his expression was something I had never seen before. It was not the gaze of a father. It was the gaze of a man seeing strangers or something else entirely." That night, Barnabas asked Elizabeth to brush her hair in the style Catherine once favored. He watched her with a concentration that made the sisters uneasy. Then he demanded Sarah put on Catherine's blue anniversary dress. When Sarah refused, Barnabas erupted, shattering dishes against the wall, screaming that they dishonored their mother's memory. Margaret noted in her journal that his tone suggested something darker, that he no longer saw Sarah as his child at all. Elizabeth, with her limited medical training, recognized the signs. Physicians of the time would have called it brain fever or nervous exhaustion, an illness born of grief, hardship, and isolation. But knowing the term offered no solution. What mattered was survival. And survival meant watching their father every hour of the day. The sisters began sleeping in shifts. One remained awake each night, listening for the scrape of footsteps or the sudden sound of their father's voice in conversation with someone who was no longer there. They discovered that Barnabas often left the house at night, braving the biting cold just to visit Catherine's body in the smokehouse. The visits lasted for hours, and when he returned, he was even more erratic, even frightening in his behavior toward his daughters. Sarah's diary entry for December 20 reveals a chilling truth about his mental state. "Last night, I followed you to the smokehouse and listened outside. You talked to Mother as if she was still alive, telling her how lonely you were, how you missed her arms, how empty your bed was without her. But then your tone changed. You began to talk about me, about Elizabeth, about Margaret, in a way that made my skin crawl. You said we were so much like Mother that in the dim light, you could imagine we were her." Christmas Day, 1867, opened the darkest chapter in the Wainwright family's tragedies. Margaret's diary tells of Barnabas waking all 3 children before dawn. He made them dress in their mother's clothes for Christmas breakfast. He had set 5 seats on the table instead of 4. When Margaret questioned the extra seat, he simply looked at her with a puzzled, honest look and replied, "That's for your mother. She'll be here soon." The mental pressure became unbearable. Elizabeth began to suffer from severe headaches. and dizziness, which she attributed to the strain of juggling daily life with her father's fading mind. Sarah's drawings became gloomy wolves with human eyes, long dark figures, hovering at the edge of the light. On December 28th, Margaret stumbled upon a shocking discovery: letters her father had hidden under her mattress. They were addressed to Catherine, but the contents revealed a sick desire for his 3 daughters, whom he believed were just like their mother. In them, Barnabas claimed that God had sent them to comfort him, and that Catherine herself, from beyond, had agreed to let him seek comfort in their arms. Elizabeth, with her limited medical knowledge, looked through old books on neurosis. She read of many cases of people who had grieved for too long in isolation, becoming detached from reality, losing the distinction between right and wrong, and losing even basic moral boundaries. But knowledge was no help when they were imprisoned in a deserted cabin with a father whose reason had collapsed. On January 2nd, 1868, Sarah recorded Barnabas's first overstep. This morning, Father cornered Elizabeth in the kitchen and tried to kiss her. He told her she looked beautiful in her mother's apron. When Elizabeth pushed him away, he flew into a rage, calling her cruel and heartless. He screamed that her mother would never refuse him and that Elizabeth had failed in her duty as a woman of the house. The fear was now palpable. The 3 sisters discussed how to protect themselves without angering their increasingly aggressive father. At the same time, the pack of wolves around the house had become bolder, approaching the house even in broad daylight, lurking like a coordinated hunting party. Their howls were no longer simple, but sounded like ghostly communication signals, trapping the girls in an inescapable obsession. Food was running low. Elizabeth calculated that with reasonable rations, the family had only enough for 6 weeks. But Barnabas ate irregularly stashed food in secret places and said that Catherine had warned of thieves. He refused to eat his daughter's food, insisting that only Catherine could prepare his meals. In her diary entry for January 8th, Margaret wrote, "We have discussed finding a way to the Hendersons, although the blizzard and the wolves make the journey almost suicidal. Elizabeth believes she can survive. But with Sarah's small size and my limited experience of survival, it seems impossible. What is more frightening if we go, Father may not leave us alone, and how dare we leave him in this condition?" The truth became clear when they discovered that Barnabas had hidden or destroyed winter gear. His snowshoes had disappeared, and his cold weather clothing had been moved elsewhere. Elizabeth wrote in her diary, "I believe he knows that his thoughts are wrong, but instead of fighting them, he has chosen to keep us here so that we cannot escape him." Then the most terrible thing happened. Sarah accidentally found more letters her father had written, this time not to Catherine, but to each of the 3 girls separately. The papers hidden in the smokehouse where Barnabas had stayed up all night to guard Catherine's body revealed a chilling truth he had written in detail about his growing sexual obsession with his 3 daughters, with plans for their marriages. There was no trace of reason or morality. Sarah wrote in her diary, "When she found the letters, Father no longer saw us as daughters. In his mind, we were simply women living in the house, potential wives who could replace Mother in every way. He wrote about our looks, our personalities, and compared our abilities as wives as if he were evaluating a business deal. Most horrifyingly, he believed that Mother had approved of these things that she had told him through Father's visits to her body. By mid-January, the girls realized that their survival depended not only on surviving the winter, but also on confronting a father who had become a dangerous threat. The man they had once respected was gone. In his place was a stranger with a familiar face and desires that grew darker by the day. On January 18th, 1868, a historic blizzard blanketed Montana. But for the Wainwrights, the storm was more than a natural disaster. It was the final wall blocking any hope of escape. In her diary, Margaret wrote a single chilling sentence. The storm made escape impossible, and father announced at breakfast that God had heard his prayers and kept his new wives with him forever. Elizabeth, with her medical eye, describes Barnabas's rapid decline. He barely slept. Spent the night talking passionately to the empty chair set for Catherine, then forced himself on her with contacts that terrified everyone. His appearance changed to a terrifying degree. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were sunken. His body was as thin as a starving animal, no longer the respected merchant. When the three sisters discovered the marriage preparations, horror filled the cabin. Sarah described finding the rings he had cast from silver coins, along with marriage certificates scrawled in shaky handwriting, stating that Barnabas intended to marry each of his children in separate ceremonies. The papers also listed the witness's name, Catherine Wainwright, in the same handwriting. On January 28th, Margaret wrote in her diary, "Today my father took me into the storeroom and showed me the ring he said was for our wedding. When I told him that he could not marry his own daughter, he screamed that I was no longer his daughter. I was just a housewife having to make up for the loss of my mother." There was no longer a fatherly gleam in his eyes, only a hunger that made me numb with fear. Elizabeth discovered something that made the situation even more haunting. Her father's proposal schedules were written out like business ledgers. He kept a detailed record of each day, which days were for romantic meals, which days were for intimate conversation and even caresses. The language was cold and calculating, making them even more chilling than the passionate words. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to use her drawings to record the evidence. Her sketches depict the cabin as a twisted version of its bridal chamber. Catherine's furniture is used as decoration, combined with personal items stolen from her daughters. Barnabas's bedroom appears as a monstrous shrine where memories of his dead wife mingle with a sick desire for his living children. Outside, the wolves are no longer the same. They openly challenge the house's defenses even in broad daylight. Elizabeth notes that the pack has split into groups, some making distracting noises, while others prowl around the wooden walls looking for weak spots. They are no longer a natural threat. They seem to be a besieging army pushing the girls into a corner. Food is nearly gone. But Barnabas is not only wasteful, he is turning food into a tool of control. "My father refused to feed anyone who opposed him," Margaret wrote. "He said that a wife who did not fulfill her duty did not deserve to eat. He made hunger a chain that bound us." The mental torture of starvation was not only cruel but also showed that Barnabas retained the ability to calculate, plan, and apply strategy, a terrible coldness hidden in his madness. The climax came on the night of January 28th, when Elizabeth awoke to find her father standing naked by her bed, holding one of his homemade wedding rings. "Her screams made me rush in," Sarah recalled, "and I saw him trying to force the ring onto Elizabeth's finger, his body shaking with excitement, his mouth murmuring prayers about doing God's will." It was no longer a fatherly scene, but a naked nightmare. The three girls struggled to restrain their father in the dark room, an experience that left an indelible impression. We could no longer hope that he would recover, Elizabeth wrote later. He had become a predator living in this house, and we were the target. Every attempt at conversation or persuasion proved a double-edged sword. The more he resisted, the more Barnabas exploded in a ferocious rage. Margaret later discovered that he had hidden knives, sharpened blades, and scattered weapons around the cabin. His military past had trained him to think tactically, making a mad father still a dangerous and calculating adversary. Sarah wrote chillingly, "When my father looked at us now, I no longer saw love or protection in his eyes, only the cold gaze of a predator weighing his prey. He believed that mother's death had freed him from all moral constraints, and that we were his reward. The most terrifying thing was that he could not understand why we were afraid, and discussed it to him. It was just an obstacle to be overcome, with perseverance and strength." By early February, the three sisters had turned the cabin into a fortress. They slept in shifts, blocked the doors with tables and chairs, and hastily hid crude weapons in the corners. But they knew that any defense was only temporary. Barnabas was stronger, more knowledgeable about his daughter's habits and weaknesses, and their kindness made it difficult for them to act decisively. February 14th, 1868. Valentine's Day marked Barnabas's downfall and the beginning of a nightmare that would forever be remembered in Montana. Margaret's diary recorded, "This morning, Father declared this the perfect day for Sarah to marry. Elizabeth and I will be witnesses to the blessing of God. When Sarah refused to wear her mother's wedding dress, which Barnabas had saved and tailored to fit his youngest daughter's small frame, he went berserk. The slap sent Sarah flying into the fireplace, blood streaming down her forehead, leaving a permanent scar. Elizabeth took a bold step and hit her father with a cast iron skillet, momentarily stunning him. It was the first real chance the sisters had to fight back. But Barnabas's madness, combined with his military strength and discipline, turned him into a wounded beast. Father growled. Margaret wrote no longer words, but monstrous sounds. We grabbed whatever was within reach: kitchen knives, iron, tongs, hot sticks. But he seemed to feel no pain. There was only hunger and hatred in his eyes, turning him into something more wolf than man. The fight lasted nearly an hour, turning the wooden house into a battlefield. Furniture was overturned, windows shattered, blood spattered the wooden walls. Sarah captured the scene in terrifying sketches. The main room in ruins, Catherine's mementos scattered among the rubble as silent witnesses to the family's demise. Elizabeth's wrist was broken, Margaret's shoulder was slashed by a knife, and Sarah, the smallest but nimble, evaded most of the attack, using her knowledge of the house and her father's habits to evade capture. The turning point came when Margaret screamed, calling out to her mother's spirit, and accused Barnabas of Catherine's anger at his actions. For a moment, he froze. In his eyes, Sarah writes, I saw a flash of the man he had been, horrified, ashamed, trembling at himself. But then the light went out. Catherine is dead, he said, snarling. You killed her by giving birth. Now you will replace her or follow her to the grave. The final stage of the nightmare came when Barnabas, realizing that his daughters would never willingly bend to his desires, resolved to claim them by force. Elizabeth's journal records his methodical attempts to subdue them, beginning with Sarah, his chosen bride. Her words carry a clinical detachment, as though the only way she could bear to write was by distancing herself from the horror of fighting against the man who had once been her shield from every danger. Margaret's quick wits bought them precious time. She seized an oil lamp and threatened to set the cabin aflame unless their father retreated. For a moment, the threat worked. But Barnabas, shaped by years of military training, saw through the bluff. He knew his daughters could never willingly destroy their only refuge in the middle of a Montana winter. Shelter was survival, and he wielded that knowledge against them. What followed was a 6-hour standoff. The sisters barricaded themselves in the storage room while their father alternated between tearful pleas and violent promises of punishment. Inside, Elizabeth tended to Margaret's gash and Sarah's head wound while they debated the impossible choices before them: remain locked away until spring and risk starvation, flee into the storm and almost certain death, or confront the predator who had once been their father. Sarah's journal captured the clarity of their decision. We realized the man outside our door was no longer our father. He was a predator who intended to use our bodies for his pleasure, whether we consented or not. The father we loved had been destroyed by grief and isolation as surely as mother had been taken by the creek. What remained would consume us if it continued to live. Margaret's entry on that same night reduces the ordeal to a single devastating truth. Tonight we learned that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the survivors as completely as death. When Forest Service rangers stumbled upon the Wainwright cabin in April 1943, they uncovered not just ruins, but one of Montana's most chilling crime scenes. Ranger Thomas Kovach described a structure half collapsed, littered with broken furniture and human remains. Inside the main room, 3 female bodies lay where they had fallen, surrounded by journals, letters, and sketches that documented the family's descent into madness during the winter of 1867-68. A 4th body was found in the smokehouse, an adult male laid carefully beside the preserved remains of a woman who matched Catherine Wainwright's description. The coroner, Dr. William Hartley, concluded that the 3 daughters had succumbed to starvation and exposure in the late winter. Their bones showed signs of healed fractures and defensive wounds, echoes of the desperate fights chronicled in their journals. Barnabas, however, had met a different end. He bore a single wound to the heart, delivered with the precision of someone who understood anatomy. Elizabeth's final journal entry, dated February 15th, supplied the missing piece. Father is finally at peace, reunited with mother in the smokehouse, where he spent so many nights speaking to her spirit. We could not allow him to continue, and we could not survive another day as prisoners in our own home. Margaret held him, while Sarah and I did what had to be done. She continued. We wrapped him in mother's quilt and laid him beside her. The storm has passed, but our strength is gone. Margaret can scarcely walk. Sarah burns with fever. My hands grow weaker by the hour. We have agreed we will not become like father. Desperation will not make monsters of us. The sisters' final writings letters, shaky and uneven, show their decision to remain in the cabin, accepting the fate that awaited them. Sarah left behind drawings of the wolves that circled their home, all winter packs larger and eerier than any naturalist had ever described, sketched with uncanny accuracy. Margaret, with her characteristic precision, recorded numbers, days of isolation, temperature shifts, estimates of the wolves that prowled just beyond the walls. Her last entry, dated March 8, 1868, reads simply, "Today marks 143 days since mother's death. We have decided that 104 will be enough." The investigation into the Wainwright tragedy uncovered even darker details about Barnabas's final descent. Hidden among the wreckage, investigators found over 60 letters, some addressed to Catherine, others to his daughters, and several to women whose identities remain unknown. These pages revealed a man who had entirely severed himself from reality, weaving elaborate fantasies and hollow justifications for desires that stripped away every trace of morality. Dr. Hartley's psychological evaluation, based on the journals and letters, concluded that Barnabas had suffered what today would be classified as a complete psychotic break, triggered by grief isolation and the relentless brutality of frontier survival. His report noted that similar collapses had surfaced in other territories, isolated families torn apart by the pressure of wilderness solitude, where ordinary men, under unbearable strain, became dangers to those they once vowed to protect. The Territorial Marshal's office briefly considered whether the daughter's actions constituted a crime. But the sheer weight of evidence, the threats, the violence, the attempted assaults, led officials to rule the death a justifiable act of self-defense. The case was quietly closed, both out of compassion for the victims and out of fear of the scandal such a case might ignite. Records show that the cabin site was deliberately erased from official maps. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves at an undisclosed location, and most physical evidence was either destroyed or sealed away in archives that remain classified to this day. Publicly, the reasoning was to protect the family's reputation. Privately, internal documents reveal that officials feared the psychological effect of releasing such a harrowing story on other isolated families. The Wainwright case reshaped frontier policy. Regulations were enacted requiring isolated settlers to maintain winter contact with authorities, and supply caches were established along major routes to give refuge to families in crisis. When questioned, local native tribes provided chilling context. Elders recall that winter as one of unnatural wolf behavior packs, far larger than usual, coordinating in strange, unfamiliar ways. They also spoke of voices and screams carried on the winter winds, sounds they attributed to restless spirits, though investigators came to realize they were likely the real cries of the Wainwright daughters echoing through the mountains. The journals became an object of morbid study for doctors and early psychologists, though access was tightly restricted. They contained passages of incestuous desire manipulation and violence, too disturbing for the public eye. Later analysis uncovered an even more horrifying detail. Some of the letters in Barnabas's hand were not his at all, but written by Elizabeth Faust to transcribe her father's dictated fantasies as part of his campaign of torment. The environmental conditions that winter sealed their fate. Records confirm that the Bitterroot Mountains endured the harshest winter in Montana's history, temperatures of 40 below zero snowfall, more than 12 feet deep. Escape would have been suicide, leaving the daughters imprisoned with their father's madness. Even the wolves bore witness. Sarah's drawings described packs of over 30, an unprecedented concentration, driven into unnatural unity by starvation and cold. Biologists now recognize her sketches as some of the earliest records of predator coordination under environmental collapse. To step beyond the cabin walls would have meant death within minutes. Though mentioned in academic studies of frontier psychology and survival, The true details of the Wainwright case remained largely hidden from the public. Efforts to locate the cabin have failed. Natural decay and deliberate concealment erased most traces, leaving behind only fragments, occasional bone shards, or rusted tools discovered by hikers but never officially confirmed. Even today, wolf packs in the Bitterroot show reluctance to settle near the suspected site. Though the land appears suitable, something unseen seems to repel them. The Wainwright story reminds us that the frontier tested more than muscles and guns. It demanded resilience of the mind, and that even the strongest could falter. Civilization's thin veneer can vanish in an instant, leaving only the raw struggle between survival and madness. But perhaps not everything has been revealed. Were the daughters' final days exactly as they wrote? Or did their journals conceal truths too unbearable to face? Could there still be secrets buried beneath the snow and pine of those Montana mountains? What do you think? Was everything truly uncovered, or is some part of the Wainwright tragedy still hidden, waiting to be found? If this tale unsettled, you remember to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with someone who finds comfort in forgotten mysteries. The frontier still whispers its secrets, and together we'll uncover them all. Until next time.